Surprise! I have a blog tour review. Isabel Kenyon let me in on this really sweet blog tour gig. Hello and welcome back. This time around it's about Nikki Dudley's new book, Volta, which is depending on when you're seeing this, coming out around about now. So let's talk about it. It's a murder book. It's a book about secrets. It's got a little romance. It's got everything. And it is so good. I read it so quickly. I just couldn't put it down. It is online at the moment since it hasn't come out officially yet, so I don't have a hard copy. But nonetheless, I couldn't click out of it. So the book follows 3.5 characters. I say half because this book, like many others, has shifting focalization, and in the case of this book, it has a different chapter per narrator / perspective. Those 3 narrators / perspectives, because only one of them is a true narrator in first person, the other 2 main focal points are told in third person, are SJ, who is a man with a dark secret and a shady past, and now he works as a defense lawyer in London. Mari, who is a pretty well-meaning, fun, snarky therapist. And then there's Briony, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but she's kind of at the center of the book. It all starts with her. The half character is Mari's brother, who happens to be a detective. His name is Eris, and he's also SJ's best friend. And I'll get to all of how they interact in a second. So when you very first start the book, Briony's waking up from, it's unclear if it's a nap, it's unclear if she's just been sleeping, if she's been knocked out, but something is up. And a very quick look around the apartment in which she's in, it's a little unclear if it's hers or her boyfriend's at the beginning. Turns out it's his. And she doesn't know where he is, and she doesn't remember what happened before waking up. She finds him in his bed, bludgeoned. Blood's everywhere, blood's on her, and she panics. She's like, oh my gosh, did I do this? So she decides to go to Mari, who's her therapist, and she's been seeing Mari because she has this long-standing kind of anxiety and grief and memory problems due to the loss of her brother. He was 4 and she was 7 when he died, and nobody really knows what happens, but just like with Ed, what she does remember is waking up right next to the lake and not having memory of what happened before. So Mari is just trying to be a good therapist and calm her down, make her feel safe, whatever. And her assistant calls the cops. And who picks her up but Mari's brother Eris. So Eris takes Briony to the station. This is very much like standard cop drama at the beginning of the book. Calls in SJ, who's a defense attorney, because, you know, right to an attorney. And SJ and Mari sit down, and there's like, it's not a spark in the manner that we often think of it in terms of like, ooh, a romantic spark. It's a spark in the fact that there's some sort of understanding between them. But even though there's an understanding, it's not equal. It's very much lopsided, because you can tell even from very early on that Briony is kind of dependent, and that she is more interested in SJ as a person and everything, or as he is more interested in her as a client and representing her and making sure that they know everything about the case. And so it's in this interview between SJ and Briony that we first learn about her brother who had passed. So I don't want to give too much away, because it was such a well thought out book and the plot was so good, and it really lives up to its name. So Volta in poetry is when there's a change in thought or a change in argument, and there are so many little like twists and turns in this book. Volta fits it perfectly, because you start to think one thing about Briony or about SJ, Not so much about Eris and Mari. I think it's safe to say that they're pretty straightforward characters. Like, they're confident in themselves. They don't really have nearly as many secrets as SJ or Briony. Eris even less than Mari, because Mari's big secret is like, ooh, I kind of like you, SJ. But will they act on it? You want to know more. You want to know more about everything, about everyone. And Dudley is such an excellent author, sprinkling little clues throughout the plot, setting up things later on that you're just like on the edge of your seat, like, oh my gosh, when are you going to realize? Or like, oh my gosh, are you going to realize? Or like, oh my gosh, I want to know too. It's so captivating because, like, you think you know one thing, you think you feel one way about a character, and then something shifts and you're like, oh my gosh, like maybe they are a shady person, like maybe they're not as innocent as they seem. And so just everything is so well developed. And unlike in some of the other books, like A Musical Affair a couple weeks ago, where there's just all this really beautiful, complex character growth, these characters are complex from the beginning, and it's not so much growth as like unfolding layer after layer and like figuring out more who they are. But it's not so much like that they're growing. It's more like they're fronting, and you're uncovering their front to see more of their true selves. And that's kind of an interesting note too, because there's this confrontation between Briony and another character later on, and it's when she's kind of lost it, like a little bit. Like I said, I don't want to give too much away, but she's on this precipice of, I don't know if a breakdown is quite the right word, but like she's remembered some stuff, and she's like, this is who I am, and she like tells the character all these things, and you're like, ooh, maybe that one character's perception of her was right. Well, you're confident that it is. I want you to want to read it because it's fascinating. Like, to open up on an apparent murder scene and then chapters later to find out that the murder scene wasn't what you thought, and then when Briony is confronted with that reality, how the other characters react with her, like, it's just so engaging. It's so engaging and so fascinating and detailed, and I love the snark between Mari and SJ because it's so painfully obvious that they like each other. It's like in Bones when you see Booth and Brennan and you're just like sitting there for 6 seasons like, oh my gosh, you love each other, like, just stop already. Or any other show where there are two characters that just like very clearly are meant to be together. And you're just like, when is it gonna happen? And I love too that even though they do find a connection, I won't get into what kind or what level of connection, it's not rom-com, oh, everything's happy now. Like, it's complicated and things don't happen the way that I think is safe to say either character expects or wants them to happen, just because personal baggage, everything going on with this murder case trial, well, it's not a trial because it never goes to court, but this murder case with Briony and just like their own personal things. It's like, this isn't necessarily one protagonist where it's like man versus world or man versus man or even man versus self. This is like, again, 3.5 characters with Briony. It's kind of all of the above. She kind of seems like one of those characters where she thinks the world is out to get her. And in the process of that, she fights with herself, and then she also like fights directly with someone else a couple of times. Mari, I feel like, is kind of woman versus circumstance, because she's kind of a supporting character. She's a main character but a supporting character in the sense that she doesn't have as much drama moving the plot forward. But the places where she's a main character, she operates in a very interesting way. And again, like none of the problems are really like caused by any one person or even by herself. It's just kind of like just with the whole circumstance of what's going on. And then SJ2, it's again a little bit of everything but I'd almost arguably say it's mostly man versus self, because he's so consumed by his own personal tragedy that it affects his work, it affects some of his all of his relationships. But seeing him kind of grow out of that and seeing him see past his trauma, which is something that Mari like asks him to do the whole book, it's just, oh, it's so good, you guys. You should definitely take a look. But yeah, I can't recommend this highly enough. Things that might turn off some readers, obviously it's crime. So if murder is particularly triggering, that might be a little bit difficult. There's also quite a few F-bombs. It does take place in Britain, and I think for any British people watching, I think y'all are just a lot more comfortable with swearing than we are here in the States. So if you don't like swearing, that might be a bit of a turn off as well. But honestly, it's just such a good book overall. I don't think that those two things should be like a nope, never gonna read this, because it's so good. It's a little over 300 pages on the digital version, at least the digital version I had, but even so, it's a quick read and the chapters aren't very long. So definitely recommend. That's what I've got for Volta for the book review. Thank you again to Isabel Kenyon for reaching out to me, and thank you for Nikki Dudley for writing this beautifully intense and fun, engaging book. So I'll be back again next week with my normal reviews. In the meantime, happy reading and thanks.